In the summer of 1938, deep in the hollows of eastern Kentucky, a county health worker named Margaret Ethridge made a house call that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She'd been sent to check on a family living in a cabin so remote it didn't appear on any map. The dirt path leading to it had no name. When she arrived, she found the girl sitting in the corner of a single room, maybe 8 or 9 years old, rocking back and forth. The girl had no name, not a nickname, not even a sound her family used to call her. When Margaret asked why, the mother looked at her with hollow eyes and said, "We knew better than to name her." Margaret wrote in her report that the child's face looked like it had been drawn by someone who'd never seen a human before. Her skull was misshapen, her eyes were too far apart, her hands curled inward like claws. But it wasn't just her appearance that disturbed Margaret, it was the silence in that house, the way no one looked at the girl, the way they spoke around her, as if she were a piece of furniture, as if she were a sin made flesh. What Margaret didn't know yet, what no one outside that hollow knew, was that this child was the result of something far darker than poverty or neglect. She was the product of generations of inbreeding so severe, so deliberate that her very existence defied medical understanding, and she wasn't the first. This is the story of the most inbred child ever discovered in America, a story buried in Appalachian soil, whispered about in church basement, and scrubbed from official records. A story about what happens when isolation, shame, and blood turn a family into something unrecognizable. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The town closest to where the girl was found no longer exists. It was called Blackburn Hollow, and by the time Margaret Ethridge arrived, it had already been dying for 20 years. The coal had run out, the railroad never came. The families who stayed were the ones who had nowhere else to go, or the ones who couldn't leave because they were hiding something. The girl's family had lived in that hollow for over a century. They were known by a surname I won't print here, not out of respect, but because the descendants who are still alive have spent their entire lives trying to escape it. In the 1800s, they were prosperous. They owned land, they had livestock, but somewhere around the Civil War, something changed. They stopped marrying outside the family, and then they stopped marrying outside the cabin. By the time Margaret found the girl, the family tree had collapsed in on itself like a black hole. Fathers were grandfathers, mothers were aunts, siblings were cousins. The girl herself was the child of a brother and sister who were also the children of a brother and sister. Her genetic code was so tangled, so recursive that when doctors later tried to map it, they gave up. One researcher described it as trying to untie a knot made of smoke. Margaret Ethridge didn't go to that cabin by accident. She'd been sent there by a doctor in the county seat who'd heard rumors. Rumors about a family that never came to town. Rumors about children who died before they could walk. Rumors about sounds coming from the hollow at night. Sounds that didn't belong to animals. The Depression had brought government workers into places they'd never been before. Social workers, census takers, public health nurses like Margaret. They were supposed to document poverty, distribute aid, take photographs for federal reports. But what they found in the mountains of Kentucky was something the government hadn't prepared them for. They found families who'd been living outside the bounds of civilization for so long they'd become something else entirely. Margaret's journal, which was donated to a university archive in 1981, describes her first moments inside the cabin. "The smell hit me before I crossed the threshold," she wrote. "Not just unwashed bodies or spoiled food, but something sweeter, something rotting. I thought at first there was a dead animal under the floorboards." There were 7 people living in that 2-room structure. A girl with no name, her parents, who Margaret estimated to be in their 30s, but looked 60, an older woman, blind and mumbling in the corner, who may have been a grandmother or great-aunt, or both, and 3 smaller children, 2 boys and a girl, huddled on a mattress that looked like it hadn't been changed in years. None of the children spoke, not one word. Margaret tried English, then the little bit of mountain dialect she picked up. Nothing. She pulled out a piece of candy from her bag and held it out to the youngest boy. He stared at it like it was a snake. When she set it on the floor in front of him, he crawled backward until he hit the wall. The father, if that's what he was, stood in the doorway the entire time, blocking most of the light. Margaret described him as tall but stooped, like something had broken inside him long ago. His hands shook, his eyes never focused on her face. When she asked him the children's names, he said, "They don't need names. They ain't going to live long enough to use him." He was right about that. Margaret later learned that in the previous 15 years, the family had produced 11 children. Only 4 were still alive. The others had died of what the family called the weakness: seizures, infections, failures of the heart or lungs or brain. There were no graves, no records. When Margaret asked where the bodies were buried, the father pointed vaguely toward the woods behind the cabin and said, "Out there somewhere." The ground takes him back. But it was the girl with no name that Margaret couldn't stop looking at. She sat in that corner, rocking her mouth hanging open, a thin line of drool connecting her lip to her stained dress. Her legs were twisted beneath her in a way that looked painful, but she didn't seem to notice. Every so often, she'd let out a sound, not a word, not a cry, just a low, guttural moan that made Margaret's skin crawl. "I've seen children with polio," Margaret wrote. "I've seen children with rickets and tuberculosis and every kind of deprivation you can imagine. But I had never seen a child who looked like she'd been born wrong, like God had looked away while she was being made." Margaret Etheridge didn't understand what she was looking at. Not at first. She thought maybe it was malnutrition, maybe some disease she'd never encountered. So she did what she was supposed to do. She filed a report with the county health department and requested that a doctor come out to examine the family. That doctor's name was Samuel Thornton, and he arrived 3 weeks later with the medical bag and a camera. What he documented in that cabin would eventually make its way into a confidential study on genetic disorders that wouldn't be declassified until 1993. By then, most of the people involved were dead. The family was gone, and Blackburn Hollow had been reclaimed by the forest. Dr. Thorne spent 4 hours in that cabin. He measured skulls. He examined eyes and ears and the formations of teeth. He tested reflexes that didn't exist. He drew blood samples that he knew would tell him something terrible. And then he sat down with the father and asked him a question that he already knew the answer to. Who was the mother of these children? The father stared at him for a long time. Then he said, "My sister." "And who is your father?" Dr. Thornton asked. "My mother's brother," Dr. Thornton wrote in his notes. Patient acknowledges multi-generational consanguineous relationships. Family tree appears to contain no external genetic input for at minimum 4 generations, possibly 6 or more. "I have never seen anything like this outside of academic hypotheticals." He was being polite. What he meant was this family had been breeding with itself for so long that the children weren't quite human anymore. Inbreeding isn't rare in isolated populations. It happens in royal families, in religious sects, in any group that closes itself off from the outside world. The Habsburgs did it for centuries, and by the end they could barely chew their own food. But what made this family different? What made the girl with no name a medical anomaly was the severity and the duration. This wasn't cousins marrying cousins. This was siblings with siblings, parents with children, an unbroken chain of shared blood going back so far that the family itself had become a genetic loop. Dr. Thornton tried to reconstruct the family tree using birth records, census data, and interviews with neighbors who remembered the family from decades earlier. What he found made him physically ill. The family had once been large, over 30 members spread across the hollow in the 1870s, but by 1900 only a dozen remained. By 1920, only 6. They didn't leave. They didn't marry out. They just kept folding in on themselves generation after generation until the genetic damage was irreversible. One of the neighbors, an elderly woman who lived 5 miles down the mountain, told Dr. Thornton a story she'd heard from her own grandmother. She said that sometime around 1880, the family had been involved in a killing. A man from another hollow who tried to court one of the daughters. The girl's father and brothers had beaten him to death and dumped his body in the river. After that, no one from the outside would go near them, and they stopped trying to leave. They made a choice. The old woman said they chose their blood over everything else, and after a while, I don't think they even remembered why. Dr. Thornton took photographs of the girl with no name. In one, she's sitting on the cabin floor, her legs pulled out at unnatural angles, Her head tilted so far to one side it looks like her neck is broken. Her eyes are open, but they're not looking at the camera. They're not looking at anything. In another photo, Dr. Thornton has placed his hand next to hers for scale. Her fingers are fused together in places, the bones malformed, the skin stretched tight and shining like melted wax. He wrote in his report, "This child should not exist. By every measure of medical science, she should have been stillborn. That she has survived to this age is not a miracle. It is a testament to the stubbornness of human biology, even when that biology has been corrupted beyond recognition." Dr. Thornton wanted to remove the children from the cabin. He wanted to take them to a hospital to document their conditions, to try, however, to give them some kind of life beyond that dark rotting room. But in 1938, in rural Kentucky, there were no laws that allowed him to do that. The family wasn't breaking any rules. Inbreeding wasn't illegal. Child neglect was barely a concept. And more importantly, no one in the county wanted to deal with what removing those children would mean because everyone knew. That's the part that makes this story truly disturbing. The neighbors knew. The sheriff knew. The preacher at the Baptist church 5 miles away knew. They'd all known for decades. And they'd all decided collectively and without ever saying it out loud, that it was better to let that family disappear on its own than to confront what they'd become. There's a document in the county archives, a letter written by the sheriff to the state health department in 1939, 1 year after Margaret's visit. In it, he acknowledges that he's aware of the family's situation. He describes them as unfortunate but harmless, and then he writes something chilling. "It is the opinion of this office that intervention would cause more harm than good. The family keeps to itself and bothers no one. Nature will run its course, and the problem will resolve itself in time." He was talking about waiting for them to die. And they did die one by one. The 3 smaller children Margaret had seen on that mattress were dead within 2 years. The blind woman in the corner lasted another year after that. The parents held on until the mid-1940s, though by then they were barely recognizable as human beings, emaciated, senile, speaking in sounds that no longer resembled language. But the girl with no name outlived them all. No one knows exactly how long she survived in that cabin alone. Some estimates say 5 years, others say as many as 10. What we do know is that in 1952, a group of hunters stumbled across the cabin and found her inside. She was in her early 20s by then. Though she looked ancient, she'd been living on rainwater and whatever small animals she could catch with her twisted hands. The hunters described her as more animal than person. She hissed at them when they approached. She tried to bite one of them. When they finally got her into the back of a truck and brought her to the nearest town, she wouldn't stop screaming, a sound one of the hunters later said didn't sound like it came from a human throat. She was taken to a state institution in Frankfurt. The records from her admission are sparse, but they include a physical description that's difficult to read. Her spine was curved so severely she couldn't stand upright. Her teeth had rotted out. Her skin was covered in sores and scars, some of them clearly self-inflicted, and her eyes, according to the intake nurse, had a look in them that suggested she'd stopped seeing the world the way other people did a long time ago. The doctors at the institution tried to assign her a name for their records. They called her Jane Doe, patient 31, and eventually just the Blackbone Girl after the hollow where she'd been found. But she never responded to any of it. She never spoke. She never made eye contact. For all intents and purposes, she'd been born without the fundamental wiring that makes someone a person. She lived in that institution for 6 more years. During that time, she was studied by doctors, psychiatrists, and geneticists who wanted to understand what happens to the human body when its genetic code becomes a closed loop. They took measurements, they ran tests, they wrote papers that were locked away in medical journals most people will never read. And then in 1958, she died. The cause of death was listed as multiple organ failure, but one of the doctors who'd worked with her said it more plainly. Her body just gave up. It had been trying to die since the day she was born. She was buried in an unmarked grave on the institution's grounds. No funeral, no ceremony, no one to mourn her. Just a hole in the ground and a wooden marker with a number on it. To understand what happened to the girl with no name, you have to understand what inbreeding does to the human body. It's not just about physical deformities or medical problems. It's about the slow inevitable collapse of everything that makes us functional. Every human being carries genetic mutations, small errors in our DNA that usually don't cause problems because we have two copies of every gene, one from each parent. If one copy is damaged, the other can compensate, but when you breed with someone who shares your blood, the chances of both parents carrying the same damaged gene skyrocket. And when both copies are broken, there's nothing to fall back on. The girl with no name wasn't just the product of one generation of inbreeding, she was the product of at least 4, possibly 6. Her parents were siblings, her grandparents were siblings, her great-grandparents might have been siblings or parent and child. The records aren't clear, and frankly, by that point, it barely mattered. With each generation, the family's genetic diversity shrank, harmful mutations accumulated, the body's ability to build itself correctly deteriorated. Dr. Thornton's blood samples, which were eventually analyzed by a research team in the 1970s, revealed something extraordinary. The girl's DNA showed a level of homozygosity, identical genetic sequences that scientists had only seen in lab experiments with isolated animal populations. Her genome looked less like a human's and more like something you'd find in a dangerously inbred line of laboratory mice. One geneticist who reviewed the data said, "If I didn't know this was from a human subject, I would have assumed it was a hoax. No one should be able to survive with this little genetic variation." But she had survived for over 20 years. Her body had fought against its own blueprint, trying to build organs and bones, and a nervous system from instructions that had been photocopied so many times they were barely legible. Her immune system was almost non-existent. She'd survived not because she was strong, but because she'd lived in such isolation that she was never exposed to the diseases that would have killed her immediately. Her skeletal structure was a nightmare of malformed joints and brittle bones that fractured with minimal pressure, and her brain, according to the autopsy performed after her death, was roughly 30% smaller than average, with sections that had simply failed to develop at all. The doctors who studied her remains noted something else, something that appeared in their reports, but was never fully explained. Her body showed signs of having been pregnant at least once, possibly twice. Given that she'd lived alone in that cabin for years after her parents died, there was only one explanation: she'd been pregnant before they died. And given the family's history, there was only one possible father. The pregnancies hadn't come to term. The genetic damage was too severe, but the evidence was there, preserved in her bones, of a final horror in a life that had been nothing but horror from the beginning. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The research team that studied the girl's case in the 1970s used her as the foundation for a landmark paper on the dangers of extreme consanguinity. They cataloged every deformity, every organ malfunction, every way her body had tried and failed to be normal. But they also asked a darker question, one that appears in the paper's conclusion: at what point does a human being stop being human? They weren't talking philosophically, they were talking medically. The girl with no name had human DNA, but it was so damaged, so compromised that her body had developed in ways that didn't match any known pattern of human development. Her skull structure was wrong, her brain was wrong, her hands, her eyes, her spine, all wrong in ways that suggested her body had been trying to build something it no longer had the instructions for. One researcher wrote, "We are forced to conclude that after a certain threshold of inbreeding, the human genome loses its ability to express humanness. What remains is something that exists in the space between what we are and what we might have been millions of years ago, a genetic echo of our ancestors trapped in a body that the modern world has no place for." They never published that part. It was too disturbing, too unscientific, but the question lingered in the minds of everyone who studied her case. Was she still human when she died, or had her family since stripped that away from her before she ever took her first breath? The girl with no name wasn't unique. That's the part of this story that's hardest to accept. She wasn't some singular tragedy, someone in a million genetic accident. She was one of dozens, maybe hundreds of children born into families like hers across Appalachia in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Children who never got names. Children who died before anyone outside their hollow ever knew they existed. children whose bodies were buried in unmarked graves or left to decompose in the woods because their families were too ashamed to acknowledge them. After Dr. Thornton's report made its way through medical circles, other doctors began coming forward with their own stories. A physician in West Virginia described finding a family in 1941 where 3 generations were living in a single room and none of the 6 children could walk. A social worker in Tennessee wrote about a brother and sister in their 40s who had produced 9 children together, all of whom had died before age 5. A county nurse in Virginia documented a case where a father had children with both his daughter and his granddaughter, creating a genetic tangle so severe that the youngest child was born without fully formed lungs. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the result of geography, poverty, religion, and shame all colliding in the most isolated corners of America. Families moved into the mountains to escape the law, to avoid creditors, to practice their faith without interference, and once they were there, once they were cut off from the rest of the world by dirt roads that washed out every spring and winters that made travel impossible, they had no choice but to turn inward. They married their cousins because there was no one else. And then when the genetic damage started to show, when the children started coming out wrong, they went deeper. They hid. They stopped going to church. They stopped trading with neighbors, and the cycle continued generation after generation until their bloodlines became poison. The state governments knew about it. Documents declassified in the 1990s show that health departments in Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, and Virginia all had files on what they called degenerate mountain families. They tracked them. They documented them. They debated what to do about them. But in the end, they did nothing because these families were white, Christian, and poor. And in the early 20th century, poor white people in the mountains were considered America's problem to ignore. There was even a term for children like the girl with no name. Medical professionals called them hollow children, a reference both to the geographic hollows where they were found, and to the emptiness in their eyes. The term never made it into official literature. It was too cruel, too unscientific, but nurses and social workers used it among themselves. They'd whisper it when they came across a family living in conditions that defied belief, when they found children who looked like something out of a medieval painting of demons. One nurse in a letter to her sister dated 1946 described her experience this way: "I thought I had seen every kind of suffering the human body could endure, but these children aren't suffering in the way we understand it. They don't know they're supposed to be something else. They've never seen a normal child. They've never looked in a mirror. They exist in some space between life and death. And I think, God forgive me for saying this, I think it would be mercy if they'd never been born at all." She was right, but mercy wasn't something these families understood. They saw their children as God's will, as tests of faith, as punishments for sins they couldn't name. The girl with no name's father had said she didn't need a name because she wouldn't live long enough to use it, but the truth was darker than that. She didn't get a name because naming her would mean acknowledging her, and acknowledging her would mean admitting what the family had done, what they'd been doing for generations. By the 1960s, most of these families were gone. Some died out naturally, their bloodlines too damaged to continue. Others were forcibly relocated when the government built highways through the mountains or turned their land into state parks. A few were quietly institutionalized, their children taken away and placed in facilities where they'd live out their lives in rooms with barred windows, their existence scrubbed from public record. But the descendants are still out there living in cities, in suburbs, in places where no one knows their history. They've changed their names. They've married outside the bloodline. They've spent their entire lives running from the shame of what their great-grandparents did in those dark hollows. And most of them will never tell their children where they really came from because some secrets are too heavy to pass down. The cabin where the girl with no name was born doesn't exist anymore. If you go to eastern Kentucky today and ask locals about Blackburn Hollow, most of them will tell you they've never heard of it. The few who have will change the subject. There's no historical marker, no mention in county history books, no acknowledgement that anything unusual ever happened there. The land was sold in the 1970s to a logging company, and whatever remained of that family's existence was bulldozed and buried under new-growth forest. But the story doesn't end with the destruction of a cabin or the death of a nameless girl in a state institution. It ends with a question that no one wants to answer. How many other families like this existed? How many still exist? In 2003, A geneticist named Dr. Laura Chan published a study on isolated populations in Appalachia. She wasn't looking for cases of extreme inbreeding. She was studying genetic markers for certain inherited diseases. But what she found disturbed her so much that she initially refused to publish her full data. In several counties across Kentucky, West Virginia, and Virginia, she discovered genetic patterns that suggested ongoing consanguinity in breeding at levels that shouldn't exist in modern America. Not cousins marrying cousins, but closer relationships, much closer. When pressed by her colleagues, Dr. Chan admitted that she'd found at least 6 families where the genetic evidence pointed to multi-generational parent, child, or sibling relationships continuing into the 1990s. She wouldn't name the families. She wouldn't say where exactly they were located. But she did say this in an interview. "We like to think of extreme inbreeding as something that happened in the past in royal families or isolated religious sects, but it's still happening right now in America, and we're not talking about it because we don't want to believe it's possible." The girl with no name has been dead for almost 70 years. But her story and stories like hers are still being written in trailers deep in the mountains where county social workers don't visit, in families that have been cut off.